Welcome, Divas and Dudes. My name is Lindsay, and today we're going to be learning about sourdough bread and fermentation. So how many people have had sourdough bread? A lot of you, right? How many have made it? No? Not yet.
Maybe after tonight?
I hope so. Yes, maybe after tonight. So first I'm going to tell you a little history about sourdough bread. Then I will show you how to make a starter. So this is my starter right here. I've named it Little Yeasty. They kind of take on a mind of their own because they're basically alive in there. So this one's over a year old, it has a personality of its own. So this is considered the mother of the sourdough starter, and it is wild yeast that just exists and lactobacillus, and those have a sort of culture where they work together to produce carbon dioxide, and that's what makes the holes in your bread. And so sourdough has been around for over 5,000 years. Commercial yeast was actually kind of invented by Louis Pasteur when he was messing around with mold, making penicillin. And before that, all the bread had it was basically a sourdough. The only way that it would get it to rise was by fermentation to get the bubbles. So he just kind of figured out how to harvest that yeast and then dry it out and sell it, basically. And that was 150 years ago. 5,000 years ago is the oldest sourdough culture they've found. And that was ancient Egypt and also Switzerland around the same time. So not even close to each other, but somebody left out some water and some flour, and then the next day they made bread, and we're like, wow, this is pretty good. So another interesting fact about sourdough is during the gold rush in California, gold rush guys would keep a little sourdough starter in their pocket, and then they would make, flatbread on the fire with their little sourdough starter. And I did read that a lot of them got sick, so maybe they weren't doing it right. But that is actually how San Francisco's famous sourdough, they're very famous for sourdough in San Francisco. How it made its way there, a French baker got it off of a gold rusher, and then that's how their famous sourdough became a thing back in the 1800s. So with your packet today, we've provided some steps to build a starter. Essentially what you do is do half flour, and Suzanne recommended doing brown rice, teff, or buckwheat. Those are all gluten-free. If you don't have to be gluten-free, you can use regular wheat flour. Rye flour is also makes a really good starter. And you essentially just mix together water and flour, and you're going to let it sit for 24 hours and just do its thing. And yes, ma'am, what's your question?
I use the organic HEB gluten-free all-purpose flour.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use that?
Yeah, so I've seen people use that.
Okay.
The only thing with that is that might have xanthan gum in it, which isn't really something you use for a starter. You may have more, if that's not working for you, more luck doing just a brown rice and water, or just a buckwheat and water, more simple one.
Okay.
Because they do mix sometimes even coconut flour in those mixes, and that has a higher fat content, and you really don't want any fat in it. That's not happy for the starter.
Okay.
So try it. This is really a grand experiment because that's how I started doing it, and learning from Suzanne and experimenting with gluten-free, taking out some cookbooks, and it's turned into something great. So it's definitely an experiment and a fun one. So we do she suggested 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. You're going to mix it together in a glass jar. So you want to let it sit for 24 hours. Then you're going to feed it again. And we call feeding it, which is just giving it another mixture of flour and water. And feeding it. So the little lactobacillus and the yeast cultures in there, they eat everything, and then they kind of run out of food. And that's why we call it feeding it, because you want those cultures to keep going. And if they run out of food to eat, there's no more carbon dioxide to produce, and then you're not going to have a nice, healthy starter. So
How do you know it's not good?
it'll start to grow mold, and you will see it not showing any action. So here in a minute, I'll show you what this looks like, and you can see it's bubbly and it looks puffy, and you can really tell. And if you look in here, this I mixed up this morning. It's really not doing anything because I didn't put much in there. So it just looks like flour and water. It's already ran out of funk, basically.
How big of a glass jar when you're doing 50 grams to 50 grams?
So how big of a glass jar? This is a really big glass jar because I make 30 loaves a week from this. Just to have in your fridge, you can use a jar this size. I really suggest maybe a bigger mason jar just because the mouth, you can get in there, dump the flour in there, and you're not having a hard time trying to stir it up or just, funneling the flour in there. So like the quart mason jars, those have the nice big mouth. Those are good. And then you can just put it in your fridge. So one of the problems I had in the beginning experimenting with this was I found one that said you have to feed your starter every day and leave it on the counter. And then people would be like, oh, what if I go out of town? Does it die? I've put all this time into it. Once your colony has started, you can put it in the fridge. I've had this in the fridge sometimes up to 10 days. And because it's a strong starter, I take it out, I can feed it a little, and then use it for bread, and it works great still. It hasn't died. The cold temperatures also kind of calm it down. Right, so it's not burning through that food as fast because it's cold, basically. And there's even been people that have dried out their starters, like dehydrated, like commercial yeast is dehydrated yeast, and to bloom it, you mix it with a little sugar and you mix it with water, and then it comes to life. And that's essentially what this is. It's yeast doing the same thing, but you're keeping yours active by having it be wet, by feeding it more flour, so it has something to eat. So once you have, if you're starting a starter from scratch, we're going through those instructions. It's half water, half flour. You let it sit for 24 hours. You give it some more half water, half flour for the next couple days.
All on the counter, leaving it on the
Just
counter.
leave it on the counter, yes. Then by day 5, you're going to kind of see it start to bubble. And a lot of people like to put a rubber band on it so you can kind of see when it gets a little fluffier and it's getting bigger, and then you feel like it's alive, And then after day 5, once you see it coming alive, you're supposed to discard. And so discard is taking out half of the mixture and then feeding it again. The reason why you do that is because it just gets to be so much, and you really don't need it to be that much to have a good colony. Like I said, this is so big because of how much I make every week. But you could, if your bread recipe says 400 grams of sourdough starter, that's really only how much you need to keep in your jar. Because then you're going to use it in bread, and you'll have a little bit left at the bottom, and you mix more flour and water, and then that little part that's left in the bottom just feeds it all back up and makes it into a big colony again. After that, once you get to days 7 through 10, you can discard every other day and feed it daily. And then once you have it established, you can put it in the fridge, like I said, really up to 10 days is the farthest I've gone with this one, but I know people have done it longer. And I had somebody in the class earlier say they even put theirs in the freezer when they left for a while and came back, pulled it out, fed it with flour and water, and then it was still alive. So the fun thing about just using yeast and water, or excuse me, no yeast, just water and flour, is that in different parts of the world, their bread tastes differently. So that's why in San Francisco, it's known for the tang. And if you went to France and had their culture that they make, it's going to taste differently because of the wild yeasts that are in the environment that just react. So that's pretty cool, right? I love that. That's the best part of it, is the science experiment. So we've gone over making a starter, and I'm going to show you how we make the sourdough bread here. We do a gluten-free one. Doing non-gluten-free at home may be a little bit easier if you're just starting out, but of course if you need to be gluten-free, I can tell you some cookbooks later that will help you. That really helped me developing it, because with gluten-free we don't have those gluten structures. So here we use psyllium husk, which is what is in Metamucil, or it's a fiber benefit. But with gluten-free baking, it helps keep those structures in the bread. It keeps the airy holes. So this is our sourdough right here. You can see it has lots of nice little holes in it. It still is pretty dense. You're not going to get those giant holes like with gluten, but this has a lot of holes in it, so when you eat it, it still feels airy enough. So we take our psyllium husk and a little bit of flaxseed. We're going to add water to it and mix this up, and you will see this will turn into sort of a gel. Ooh, turn into a mess and a gel. Yeah, you are in the splash zone. You better watch out. Okay. Yeah. Free samples. All right. So we're going to mix this first stage. And we've got our flour mix here. And this is what we call a sponge. So baking large amounts of loaves at a time, we use something called a sponge, which is part of the starter, some flour and some water, and you let this sit for a couple hours and it gets nice and foamy and bubbly. If you're baking at home, you can just feed your starter and then use that right into your bread. This is something to kind of multiply even more what this is. And I know that's a little confusing. If you look up sourdough recipes, it will say a well-fed starter, use a well-fed starter, and really they just want to make sure you're like bubbly like this looked when you looked at it. It's nice and active. It's putting off the carbon dioxide. So we've got our sponge, our sourdough starter. Smells nice and tangy. We've got our flour mix. So we use a mixture of gluten-free oat flour, sorghum flour, tapioca, and potato starch. Those starches, again, do help with the structure of it.
What was the third one? There's oat flour, sorghum.
Tapioca starch and potato starch. And that is a lot of what you'll find in some of those gluten-free 1-to-1 mixes will be something similar to that as well. And we also like to add hemp hearts for some nice plant protein in there. You can also do pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds if you want, a nice textured one. The only thing I would warn against is not adding anything that's going to soak up water. So we thought for a minute maybe we should add chia seeds, but you know how they soak up all of that moisture, and that would just change the complete structure of the bread. You want something that's solid already, like pumpkin seeds, sunflower. Okay, so this is going to come together pretty quick, and it's done mixing once it starts pulling away from the sides, just kind of like a regular gluten dough, I should say. The only thing is that gluten-free doughs a lot of times are very sticky. If you've worked with some of them at home, they're very wet and sticky. So you just know that going in, that it's supposed to be like that. So with gluten doughs, you can over mix them and start killing off the gluten. You can also have them overproof. We don't have that problem with gluten-free. That psyllium husk isn't going anywhere. You can't overbeat it. So sometimes when I make it here, I can put it in the mixer and get caught helping somebody up front and come back 10 minutes later and it's fine. So the one thing about this is that you don't have to worry about overbeating it or overproofing it. It's not going to get messed up if you do that. Okay, so these are called bannetons. They are really just a way for the loaf to form. If you're doing this at home, you can use just a regular bowl like this. What it does is kind of hold a structure on the side, so when the bread's rising, it just kind of supports it. It also makes the really pretty lines that you kind of see around the edge here. So, bannetons. It's like a French bread making tool. Banneton is a banneton. Yes, ma'am. All right, so we got a nice tangy smelling dough right here. It is quite sticky, so you do have to make sure that you are flouring your bannetons and flouring the surface you're working on, of course. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen bread making videos before, and they pull the corners, or they have a way that they're folding it. The whole reason they're doing that is because you don't want any weird seams in your dough. because when you're cooking it, the steam will escape through those seams and then make it all lumpy and weird. So that's for one reason why we put slashes in it, because we're controlling where the steam's going when your bread's baking. And why they have all those folding techniques. Now, because this one's so sticky, it comes together really easily. Sometimes gluten doughs, you really have to make sure the seams, you know, when you're rolling them, you'll still see the rolls in there. This is just very wet, so you can want to have the smoother side that's going right into the banneton. And then it just sits in here. Like I said, very sticky. And then you can see, eventually when I would go to bake this, I would plop it out like this, and you can see how it's formed into a nice, pretty loaf like that. Now these can sit anywhere from, I think the least amount of time I've experimented with is 4 hours. The most I've done overnight, but I did have it sitting out in the bakery and then put it in the fridge overnight because I was worried it was going to get too big. And we have a really hot bakery back there when all the ovens are on. So sometimes I can see them start to really puff up just because it's so hot back there. And I'm like, okay, we got to get these puppies in the oven. Because if they start to get really big, because there's no gluten structure, when I slash them, they'll kind of puddle out a little bit. So it's still beautiful bread inside. I just don't like the shape as much. I'm just experimented so much. I like it a specific way. So this is what I'm talking about with slashing it. This is called a lame. It is another French tool for bread making, and it is basically a razor blade on a stick. You can use a really sharp knife. If your knife's not too sharp though, it kind of drags through the bread. It just doesn't make it as pretty. I'm sure you've seen some of those pictures where they do those really elaborate things. I have not done that because I just want the bread to turn out good, but they look so pretty when they do, and then of course you have to cut into it and eat it. So with the slash, you would essentially go right down the middle, and I like to go almost a good inch in there because you really want to control where the steam's coming out. And you can see right here on this half loaf how big that has opened up, and y'all can take a closer look later. And then I do a couple slashes on the edges. In the past, I didn't go as deep when I was first experimenting, and you would have a little ridge at the very bottom of the bread that would be gummy almost, and it's because the steam was not able to fully escape from the bottom of the bread. So if you're experimenting with bread and the bottom part isn't quite right, try getting bigger slashes in there. So really that steam has to go somewhere or just gets stuck in there, and you just have like pudding, you know. Okay, so the benefits for sourdough, we definitely have to talk about those. First of all, it's a really great prebiotic. Prebiotics are different than probiotics in that they are really existing in the large intestine, and it's fiber that makes its way to the large intestine and then really helps your gut biome in that area of your body. So probiotics are kind of in the tummy, and then the next stage is the prebiotics, and that really helps with your whole gut health, which I know Suzanne has talked a lot about. It helps with, you know, brain health. It's an antioxidant, so it helps fight free radicals in the body, anti-cancer. It's good for blood sugar. Also, something with the fermentation where it's breaking down the acids in there makes the nutrients in there more bioavailable. So you're actually getting, just even from a gluten bread that's flour, water, you know, and natural yeast, you're getting more nutrients from it than you would some other bread, right?
So even though it's cooked, see, because you know I take a probiotic.
So the probiotics, that cooking kills a probiotic. This is a prebiotic. And so that's the fiber that's making its way past the stomach, and it still exists even though it's cooked, but different than a probiotic. But it still helps with the happy bacteria in your body. They feed on that prebiotic fiber and make your gut biome happy, basically. That's the good bacteria that you want in your body. It also has the polyphenols, which help with the free radicals. And I know Suzanne's talked about those. Those are a plant compound that help with having a healthy body. And the fermenting acts as a natural preservative. So the other day I went to Costco and I bought a pack of sourdough, and they were all individually sealed, like vacuum sealed, and they had a little liquid, you know, those little packs that come in like beef jerky, the little silica thing, had a little silica in there, and it said that this bread could sit on the shelf, not refrigerated or frozen, till October. And the ingredients, it was organic, and the ingredients were wheat flour, salt, water, and natural sourdough starter. And it because of how they vacuum sealed it, and I guess put that mold inhibitor packet in there, it could just sit there. And I wanted to bring one in here, but we're gluten free, so I didn't want to taint the place. But really, really crazy how the fermentation is a natural preservative. Yeah, and it also makes it have that nice tangy flavor, which y'all are used to. So, okay, does anybody have any other questions?
What's the name of the tool that makes the cut into the?
What's the name of the tool that makes the cut? This is the lame. So it's LAME. And a lot of Amazon sells just a package where it's like a lame, a banneton, and a couple other little tools you probably don't need, but for like $30. So yeah, so you can get a little kit. The only thing is you do have to buy replacement razor blades because these get dull. And after I use like one a week here, but they're pretty cheap. They're just a little, yeah. Any other questions?
So that goes on the bottom of that dough. The bottom of
The
dough.
cutting goes on the
Yes.
bottom? No, the cutting of is actually on the top.
Okay.
So,
You have to let it rise.
right, so you
Gotta
can
flip it.
see right here, this is a
Yes.
baked one. This is the slash I made right down the middle.
Oh, wow.
And right here, the cuts on the side. So it really opens up, you know, and expands for all of that steam to come out. So when baking the dough, you let it rise for 4 to 8 hours, however long you're doing, and then you'd preheat your oven very, very hot. So we do 450 here, and I put down sheet pans and I flip them all out,
Right.
and then slash them all and put them in there, and they bake for almost an hour. I rotate them. If you're doing it at home, you can do that with a cast iron pan. That actually works a lot nicer. I just can't fit 15 cast iron pans in our oven. But you can preheat the cast iron pan in there and flip your bread into it and just slash it right there in the pan, and then bake it in there. Yeah. Any other questions? No? All right, y'all. Thanks so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this little lesson on sourdough bread and fermentation.